Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to our final episode of Codex Wallerstein. We've gone through the entirety of the longsword section now, and we're down to just the last two plays, which are, we're definitely going to be finishing with a bang. And joining me once again is Yellow Hat Ryan, who's been helping me a lot through this series. Now, as you noticed by the crash pad there and the fact that he's holding a synthetic sword, today is going to involve a throw. Now, specifically, this is billeted in the Codex Wallerstein as being a good technique for a particularly strong man. Now, the reason that this is marketed as such, if you will, is because essentially what's going to happen is I'm going to use my sword as a crowding in device and then discard it entirely for sake of putting two hands on my opponent. Now, I will say, in regards to what a strong opponent, a particularly strong man means, is number one, if you are a bigger person, you're going to be, of course, fighting people that weigh less than you. This is not a bad technique for you by default. However, if you're also an experienced wrestler, this shouldn't be too difficult for you to adapt to. But basically what's going to happen is, once again, Ryan and I are going to go down into the scale, and I'm going to wind up against him, but I'm going to use that wind to actually shove my crossguard up and forward. Now, I'm turning my thumb onto the blade so I can get his hands and his sword as high as I possibly can. That's very important. Sometimes, depending upon what reaction your opponent does, they may have their sword more forward, or they may curl it back up. Either way, if my sword kind of comes off, but my knuckles are against his, use your forearms to open him up even more. This will allow, with one, opening him up for the takedown, and number two, because my next move is going to be to release my sword, basically straight behind me. So I won't do the throw for this first part, but I'm going to show the discard basically in completion. So we come to the scales. Because I basically went straight over my head, my sword doesn't have the danger of landing on me, even if I stay still. It just kind of ditches straight back behind me. As a note, by the way, in tournament, you are allowed to ditch your sword for sake of throwing someone. That is a-okay. Just be aware if you're, fighting on floors you care about, don't do this with a steel. But, either way, once I get that sword up and I ditch it, now we look at some variation, right? So he's currently high and I've kind of pushed into him. I can do the following technique in a couple different ways. This is essentially going to be just a double leg takedown. As such, you can do it in, you can do it in the modern way, in which case I'm going to basically just plant my head on the outside of Ryan's right hip. I'm going to put my shoulder into his midsection. I'm going to bring my arms around. I'm not necessarily grabbing and enveloping. I'm more of just sort of reaping and just take them over like so. Relatively simplistic, relatively quick, very good for if you're in heavier gear, as there's not a ton of chance of you getting hooked on anything. Downside of it being, though, that if he panic grabs onto you, you can get your head dunked, which can quite, suck quite a lot. But that's the first variation. The second variation, if I want to take him down, is instead of going for just a quick double leg, what I do is I go a little bit lower, and I'm going to bring my hands around and actually clasp them together. This looks to be a little bit more like what they're doing in the technique, is they're really kind of bringing their arms to the point that they either gable grip it, grab their own wrists, something along those lines. And specifically, the text says to go at their feet / their ankles. So I'm going to go a little bit lower, bring those together, and now since I'm underneath them a bit more, I'm going to get more lift for my effort, really. But yeah, as you can see, tends to drive me down with him as well, but can be a little bit more effectual. Especially if someone is closer in weight to you. Because sometimes with a double leg, they can sprawl out, they can do things along those lines. If I envelop, he's not going to be escaping me. The only downside then becoming that I am much closer to him, much more likely to fall over. Now, the other option you can do is, rather than doing a double leg, is instead to turn this into a bit more of a lift. This one is probably the rarer for it to come up, and really will tend to come up only if, after you ditch your sword, he starts to try and bring his pommel down or something along those lines, and thus kind of puts himself onto your back. At which point he's just going to be standing up, and you'll get a little bit more slam for it. Like I said, that one's relatively rare and requires him to do stimulus back against you that isn't mentioned in the text. Bear in mind that it could happen, and you may end up with them more onto your shoulder. I have also seen throws like this sometimes end up with you unintentionally taking them over your back, which happens, but not what the technique is going for. So, altogether, we have a relatively simple series of takedowns But there is one glaring question when you look at the picture for this one, which is, why is his face buried in his crotch, right? As far as, and Ryan gets nervous because I didn't tell him about this part. Anyway, as far as, historical depictions of techniques go, this one kind of drew the shortest stick. I mean, dude's face is all up in that. It's really awkward. It's actually been turned into a meme a couple times. But the reason for this is actually because I'm going to use my head as a posting point. So, especially in wrestling such as Ot the Jew or other systems, you will sometimes see, in lieu of putting your head to a side of a hip, you'll instead bury it into their torso, right? So I go down, I grab close to these ankles, and I'm now using my straightened spine, my neck's flexed, and I'm basically headbutting him into the chest. We see this a couple times, and it can be very, very effective, presuming that you practice and you don't let your neck go from side to side. It's also quite nice if you have a mask on, because it makes that a little less bulky. You can't really get hooked on anything. But altogether, we have a relatively simple technique that now I'm going to throw my stuff on, and we'll do a couple different variations of it. So, and as you see, depending upon how the ditch goes and how low I put myself, I get more or less throw on Ryan, which is a-okay, honestly. Most times when I do this, if I do this to someone, if I go for picking a leg in ring and longsword, there is always a huge probability of some things going wrong. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And so making sure that one, when you ditch your sword, it's going somewhere that you can account for it. Because if I just throw the sword away and it ends up behind him, you could land on that cross guard, something really bad could happen. Number two, even if you are strong enough to pick someone up and really slam them, you shouldn't. Better for me to go with him, so that way I've taken him down, then you can get on top and show that you had dominance, etc. But as a note, in friendly sparring, make sure you're comfortable being thrown, make sure you're comfortable throwing people, make sure you have that understanding before you start using these kinds of techniques. And in competition, make sure you check the rules very closely to make sure that this sort of thing is okay. And if you're going to use it, make sure it is your best option, right? Don't be that person that, hurts somebody who doesn't know how to fall, right? Anyway, though, that's our first technique. Now we get to not slam you into the ground a couple times and instead work on a fun disarm. So, let's get our feels out. So, our follow-up technique and our final technique is actually going to be relatively similar to one that we went over earlier. It's going to be, once again, a kind of scissors type takeaway, but this one is a little different. So if you remember before, the one we did was where we came to the bind and he wound up against me. I used that tempo to grab through, pop out, and take it this way. Now we're going to basically do the inverse of that. So rather than coming up from below, we're actually going to go forward and then back through. So we come into the scales, we're here. Off of this, I can just go immediately. I don't need to wind, I don't need to do anything. And this can be particularly nice if you're a little closer together like we are right now. As right now we've got kind of equal pressure, there's not a ton to do. I'm going to reach up, and I need to make sure that my right hand is keeping his pressure off to the side. Because if I just relax it, bad things happen. So, reach up, I'm going to push forward, insert it kind of behind his hand, and just step back hard to rip it away. Now, sometimes it'll just pop out of his hand like that, and that's great, grand, and wonderful. It's very smooth, it's very good action, right? Boom. Just pop it away. Other times, as you see, you'll catch his glove, you'll catch his arm a little more. So sometimes you may end up with a bit more of a lock than you wanted, which will look a bit like this. So I grab it, I fish through, I get a little more of his wrist, and as such, I kind of end up pulling him down. That's a-okay too. The nice thing about that is it doesn't put a ton of pressure on the wrist when you do it. And in heavies or other forms of glove, It protects the wrist a decent amount, but be aware you are manipulating someone's hand, so do so gently. Most times when you do it, you just feel like you're being pulled off your feet, so most people comply pretty quickly. But we'll go ahead and switch sides real quick, then I'll throw on my stuff and show that again. So we come into relatively close scales, grab, insert, pull, and get it out of his hand. Sometimes that may happen as well, where he just breaks his grip and lets go with his dominant hand. If that happens, here's a little bit of advice for you. So I'm in here, I reach up, I grab, and he lets go with his lead hand. Now that gets pretty awkward, right? Currently, I'm stuck holding two swords that I can't use, and he's holding one sword that he can sort of use, right? At this point, your best bet is probably to just go ahead and ditch his sword entirely. So just let go with your fingers, follow up with that quick thrust as best you can, however you see fit, right? This is going to be one of those situations where, if I were writing it, I would say, do as you know well, as when it does occur, it's best to just ditch his sword, stay tight to him. There's not a ton he can do to you from that distance, especially with only his left hand on the sword. If he were at further distance, he could maybe whip it around or something along those lines, but that close, you're relatively safe. But again, close, grab, rip it out of his hands, no real difficulty. So now I'm going to throw on my gear, and we're going to go through it a couple times. Throw a little more fluidly. Now you may also notice that sometimes you mess up and you don't get the hook you wanted. You still have this turning into other plays you know, so bear that in mind. There we go. And with that, we're at the end. Thank you very much, Ryan. So, that's it, guys. That's the end of the longsword section of Codex Wallerstein. Technically, it's not. I should point out, by the way, Codex Wallerstein does have some other later period drawings that don't have associated text. It also has a few, similar to the old style, images that are either by a different hand or by a different master that do have text associated with them, and I might tackle that, but for the most part, this is kind of the end of the official longsword section, if you will, that you can follow along with on Wiktenauer if you're not already. We went just chronological order of the way you'd read it from top to bottom. But either way, I would love to return to this particular system again. There's a lot of fun stuff. There's Messer versus Dagger, there's Messer on its own, there's Messer versus Longsword. I could maybe sink my teeth into that. And then, of course, a ton of stuff on the wrestling. But either way, thank you very, very much for sticking with this, those of you that have been watching since the beginning, and all the people that have helped me out filming this, you know, taking extra time after classes. But I'm hoping to dive into some other series soon. Maybe I'll tackle a different source or something along those lines, but either way, make good use of these techniques. They're all really fantastic. They all do a great job at what they do, and really, most of them will work pretty immediately for you with a little bit of practice. I've seen / pulled off the majority of these techniques in sparring without too much difficulty after a little bit of practice, so I'd say it's a very useful series to learn from. But either way, thank you very much, and we'll go over some other techniques another time.